Shall bring you further news as quickly as we
Welcome to a Byzantine leg of our historical journey on technology and diplomacy. We travel through different epochs from prehistory and first forms of proto-diplomacy through early civilization of ancient East, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Assyria, and their inventions of, for example, writing, to ancient Greece with its rich legacy for our time, democracy, philosophy, up to the upcoming epochs. This month, we'll focus on the Byzantine diplomacy. First of all, let us locate Byzantine in time and space, answering the question, when did it happen? There are three major periods in Roman history: 509 to 27 BC, Roman Republic, 27 BC, 476, end of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Byzantine Empire, 330 till 1140, 53. Where did it happen? Where the Byzantine Empire existed? At its greatest extent in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian, the Byzantine Empire covered much of the land surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, including what is now Italy, Greece, and Turkey, along with considerable portion of North Africa and Middle East. Istanbul was Constantinople, and Constantinople was Byzantium. The term Byzantine comes from the Byzantium, the name of the city where Constantine moved his capital, leaving Rome. He rebuilt it and gave it a new name of Constantinople, and the city is located at the crossroads of East and West, Europe and Asia, in the place of today's Istanbul in Turkey. There is a legend of the foundation of Byzantium that speaks about its favorable position. According to this legend, Byzas, son of King Nissos, consulted the Delphi oracle on where to establish a colony. The oracle instructed Byzas to settle it opposite the land of the blind. Byzas found a great natural harbor, the Golden Horn, on the Bosphorus and at the entrance of the Sea of Marmara, right opposite the town of Chalcedon. He considered the Chalcedonians blind because they missed to see the advantage of the European side of the Bosphorus over the Asian side where they were located. In 667 BC, he founded Byzantium, thus fulfilling the oracle's requirement. The Byzantine Empire was known to its inhabitants as the Roman Empire, or the Empire of the Romans. They considered themselves as Romans. From Rome to Byzantine. Before we dive deeper into the Byzantine period, let us see quickly how diplomacy was practiced by Romans, by Rome. Most of the ancient Greek inventions in the field of diplomacy were adopted and further developed by Rome. Envoys were sent abroad, and for larger responsibilities, more serious negotiation, they would establish an embassy, legatio, of 10 to 12 ambassadors, legati, chosen for their skills at oratory. During the period of the Roman Republic, it was the Senate who conducted foreign policy, and obviously during the empire, the emperor made decisions in foreign affairs. As Rome expanded, it had to negotiate and make treaties with the conquered states. Roman law, which stressed the sanctity of the contracts, became the basis of treaties. The sanctity of the treatise was absorbed by the Roman Catholic Church and preserved till our time. Today, one of the core principles of international law is pacta sunt servanda. Agreement must be kept. And we could trace their origins in the long history, definitely in Roman law. When the Western Empire disintegrated in the 5th century of our era, the eastern half of their empire continued for nearly 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. Therefore, this is the reason why we call it elixir of longevity. It was one of the most impressive achievements of Byzantine was its very survival during a period of 1,123 years. It was one of the longest lasting social organizations in history. Byzantine survived through adaptation. The backbone of the Byzantine Empire's longevity was its administration, which managed to adapt to frequent changes of rulers and ongoing crises on its borders. With relatively limited military force, diplomacy was the key for the empire's survival. Diplomacy was definitely a necessity for Byzantine, as we indicated, because of its borders and its limited military might. Thus, one of the golden rules of the Byzantine elite was to avoid wars at almost all costs. They were fully aware that Byzantium, even with the occasional victory, would lose in the long term if it engages in military conflicts. Even in Byzantine time, the war was expensive. It costed more than, let's say, bribing and finding other solutions to end the conflict. Byzantine Empire inherited practices from the period. The Byzantine period was probably the most important in the history of diplomacy. It created a bridge between diplomacy of the ancient era and modern diplomacy. The Byzantine Empire was both a conductor of the experience from Mesopotamia, Assyria, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and innovator for the future of diplomacy. And Byzantine passed that legacy to Venice and Renaissance diplomacy. Let's see what Byzantine absorbed from the ancient civilization, what it got into the system and then passed to Renaissance cities in Italy. From Hellenistic East, it got elaborate protocol and ceremonies, dynastic marriages to cement an alliance, trade diplomacy by merchant ambassadors. From Greece, Byzantine took importance of rhetoric as a tool for public diplomacy. Although Byzantine envoys rely far less on oratory than those dispatched by, let's say, Greek city-states. From Rome, Byzantine took tactic of divide et impere, the first development assistance in the form of creating civil engineering projects. This was the legacy which Byzantine took from all of those civilizations. What were innovations that Byzantine introduced? First, it was so-called proto-ministry of foreign affairs. In Byzantium, diplomacy evolved from ad hoc to organized government activity through so-called Office of Barbarian Affairs. The barbarians were all foreigners. Thus, it would be nowadays Office of Foreign Affairs. The office housed numerous interpreters, translators in foreign languages. Similar to the modern Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the office prepared Byzantine envoys for missions abroad, analyzed reports which arrived from envoys, organized visits of foreign dignitaries to Constantinople, prepared international treaties, and so on and so on. The office established the archive as the way to preserve institutional memory of Byzantine diplomacy. Unlike modern diplomacy, Byzantium did not have permanent diplomatic missions, embassies. Envoys were sent abroad in order to deal with specific issues, mainly crises. but some missions lasted for several years. Second major innovation of Byzantine diplomacy is use of soft power, public diplomacy, and use of protocol in diplomacy. Byzantine realized very early importance of winning the hearts and minds of their neighbors. Whenever possible, they turned their neighbors from potential enemies into friends. Their public diplomacy toolkit included the conversion of nomadic tribes, mainly Slavs, to Christianity, the use of elaborate ceremonies in Constantinople in order to impress foreign dignitaries, and, for example, the education of future rulers of neighboring countries in Constantinople's leading schools. You will notice that some of these public diplomacy techniques are still used today. Byzantium excelled in the use of protocol and ceremonies with the main aim to impress foreign dignitaries. Constantinople, with its location and magnificent construction like Hagia Sophia or Hippodrome, was a very impressive place, as it is today. In addition, the Byzantine state developed elaborate ceremonies in order to show the sublime character of the empire. The emperor received foreigners in the Magnaura palace, where he sat on automated golden throne, surrounded by golden lions that roared and golden birds that tweeted. A special hydraulic system elevated the throne to the ceiling of the palace, making a very lasting impression on visitors. The Book of Ceremonies, compiled by Constantine VII in the 10th century, described in details the court rituals, seating arrangement, and other protocol details. It was probably one of the first protocol books. Another invention of the Byzantine was introduction of regular diplomatic reporting. Envoys had an obligation to send written diplomatic report back to Constantinople. The reports were archived in the Office of Barbarian Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The content of diplomatic reports was not very different from modern days diplomatic reports that we saw from, let's say, WikiLeaks diplomatic cables which were leaked a few years ago. They dealt at the Byzantine time with local political developments, the personalities of leaders, analysis of power struggle, and so on and so on. Next innovation of Byzantine diplomacy was some sort of proto-intelligence service. Access to information was central to Byzantine Empire. In order to obtain the right information, Byzantine created the first intelligence service, consisting of a network of officials and unofficial agents, including merchants, missionaries, and military officers, all of those who traveled abroad. In order to ensure secure communication, they further enhanced the Roman cipher protection, so-called Caesar cipher. And it worked very well, and it provided a lot of security for Byzantine. Another innovation was early multi-stakeholder diplomacy. Byzantine used the service of merchants, priests, and other citizens who travel abroad. All of them served as Byzantine diplomats. They had a duty to report back to Constantinople from their travels. In this way, Byzantine diplomacy managed to achieve a rather difficult task of maintaining a huge empire with very limited power and financial resources, but maximizing on internal human and other resources. Another innovation is in early international law. Byzantine diplomacy observed international treaties signed with neighboring tribes, although these were framed as unilateral decrees, since the emperor, Byzantine Empire, claimed to be the ruler of the whole world. In the long term, Byzantine benefited from introducing predictable and legal relations with otherwise unruly tribes on its borders. Even when it had to go to war, it tried to find legal justification for it, such as the concept of just war, reclamation of lost imperial territories, or defense of the empire. The introduction of legal aspect to relation with foreigners had an important impact on develop more civilized relations in Mediterranean and wider European context. In some cases, adherence to legal restricted room for maneuvering for the otherwise very pragmatic Byzantine diplomacy. Even in such situation, the Byzantine Empire avoided breaking the rule. When it had a power, it employed a very complex interpretation of treaties in order to justify its action in accordance with signed treaties. It made the empire master of interpretation and constructive ambiguities. Let's bring another innovation in Byzantine diplomacy. It's mastering of the time management. In the empire, which existed 1,123 years, time always played an important role. Over such a long time span, the Byzantine Empire preserved many distinctive features, including the way it conducted diplomacy. Byzantine diplomacy mastered the use of time in its activities. In most cases, playing a waiting game was in Byzantium's best interest, which is solid institution. Byzantine was always ahead of nomadic tribes who were easily affected by disease, a change of weather. Thus, in time of conflict, the key for Byzantine diplomacy was to let time pass in order to diffuse tension and choose the right moment for counter-action. Let's hear from Katerina if there are any comments so far. Katerina, over to you.
Hello, Jovan. Hi, everyone. Yes, we have received a question from Andrew. He wonders if the Byzantines consider the Latins and other kingdoms of the West as barbarians in the old use of the word. He also sent another question. He said not so much questions, but he wonders if a diplomatic solution was ever possible to the Fourth Crusade siege and subsequent sacking, although he guesses all the infighting prevented that from coming together comprehensively. So that will be everything from my end for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, conceptually speaking, Byzantine rulers, emperors, consider them as the only rulers. It is a bit of continuation of a tradition from Rome, or what we had on the other side with the Chinese perception of their kingdoms as the only rulers of the world. In that context, all outside, especially in early days, were considered as barbarians. Obviously, after the Charlemagne and the other developments, they started realizing that there were other rulers. And yes, I agree that we cannot consider this long period of almost 11 centuries as completely unified. With Crusaders and with the divide on the Eastern and Western church, Christian church, it was much more difficult to Byzantine to especially after, let's say, 1204, after the 13th century, and that they tried still to use diplomacy, but it was much more limited because this balance between economic, military, and the religious power tilted towards the Western societies, which in the meantime consolidated their position after the end of the Western Roman Empire. Therefore, diplomacy had limited possibilities in that period. Let's see now what was Byzantine contribution to communication and technology, another pillar of our journey. Byzantine contributed to technology, philosophy, science, arts, architecture, as well as so-called invention and innovation that we can summarize in the following ones. On communication, communicating across the expanses of the huge empire was necessary for both administrative and also diplomatic purposes. The Byzantine used a system of beacons, for example, during the Arab-Byzantine wars. They inherited it from Greece. They used it to transmit messages from the border with the Caliphate, across Asia Minor to Constantinople, for example, in the 9th century. The system was devised during the reign of the Emperor Theophilos by Leo the mathematician, one of the leading thinkers of that time. The main line of beacons stretched over some 450 miles, and it's functioned through two identical water clocks placed at the two terminal stations, which we discussed last month with the Greek invention of it. The development of Rome, old Rome, from a small city-state into vast empire, brought with it necessity for reliable and speedy communications with the governors of distant provinces. This need was met by some sort of proto-postal system with the relay stages established as convenient intervals along the long great roads of the empire, form an integral part of complex military and administrative system. And then Byzantine inherited it from Rome. The speed with which messengers were able to travel was not to be rivaled in Europe until the 19th century. It has been claimed that more than 270 kilometers could be covered in a day and a night, which was really, really fast for that time. In the field of warfare, they had a few inventions. Greek fire played a crucial role in defense of the empire against the early attack of the Muslim Arabs. Invented by Kallinikos, it was the flame thrower of the era. It was liquid fire used by Byzantine Navy to inflame in particular, enemy ships. It was used in maritime fires. The exact composition was a well-guarded state secret composition of that fire. Then hand trebuchet, a staff sling mounted on a pole using a lever mechanism to propel projectile, was another invention. It was invented during the time of Emperor Nicholas in this campaign to disrupt enemy lines. Counterweight trebuchet, which was far more powerful than the normal traction trebuchet, it was used by Emperor Alexios Komnenos, and it is said that impressed his crusaders, they're coming at that time, during the siege of Nicaea. That were military invention. When it comes to architecture, obviously Rome excelled, and Byzantine as well developed several new forms of architecture. So-called the crossing square layout, square center with the internal structure shaped like a cross, topped by a dome. This layout will dominate the building of Greek Orthodox churches later on for the next 1,000 years. The so-called pendative dome, which placed a circular dome over the square room, was another innovation, obviously for building churches. The first and foremost example of pendative dome is obviously Hagia Sophia, designed by Isidore of Miletus, and it was a masterpiece of architecture even today. There was a pointed arc bridge, the bridge resting on a pointed arc, which appeared first in the 5th century. Therefore, they invented quite a few things in architecture. In daily life, on social life, probably the best known is Corpus Juris Civilis, so-called the Code of Justinian, which was the collection of legal rulings from previous centuries and the agreement to form a definite body of law. It was codification. The Byzantine Empire continued the legal tradition of the Rome and carried over many of the rulings from the Roman Empire, which involved from institutions that exist in more or less the same form today. We are living in the health crisis. The hospitals, the idea of general and permanent place to offer medical care and possibility of cure for the patient came about due to ideals of Christian charity. After the First Council of Nicaea in 325, headed by Constantine himself, their construction began in every place with a cathedral. The hospitals were in a way innovation on invention of the Byzantine. Ship meals were introduced by General Belisarius during the siege of Rome in 6th century. As the Ostrogoths had cut off the water supply by aqueduct, it is a water wheel built on a floating platform or ship. The passage of the water turns the wheel, and this then produces force which can be applied to grinding wheat. Therefore, there were quite a few innovations in Byzantine. Let's see this bridge from Byzantine to modern diplomacy. Many core elements of Byzantine diplomacy exist even now. They were passed onto the modern era via the Italian city-states, mainly Venice. As we'll see next month, Italian city-states established the first permanent embassies. From Italy, the way of running diplomacy and experience from Byzantine moved to emerging European national states, and they innovated it further. France, for example, created the first formal Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the 17th century. And their experience was followed by other European states. When we remove the trappings of our time, we can see that in essence, many tools of Byzantine diplomacy are still in use today. Lessons from our time. What are the lessons that we can learn from Byzantine Empire? First, it's time management. Because successful diplomacy requires consistent efforts over a long period of time. Diplomacy requires time, which is in contradiction with the essence of our time, the need for immediate action, and overall immediacy of social media and the digital era. Second legacy is the centrality of information. The Byzantine realized the importance of information on what is going abroad. And they use it as advantage by controlling all neighboring tribes for almost more than 1,000 years. The advancement of technology, and especially the internet industry, have brought this issue in sharper focus, including the question of asymmetry of different players when it comes to information. Third lesson is that Byzantines innovated gradually. They learned new techniques, collected feedback, and then they introduced it. Today, when many things are hype, this could be a very valuable lesson. They were master of using early Gartner curve logic by identifying innovation, avoiding hype, and using it effectively. In that sense, we can learn a lot from Byzantine handling both innovation in technology and diplomacy. And finally, why innovating, it is important to keep the basics in the mind. What is the purpose of diplomacy? In the case of Byzantine, it was the maintenance of the empire. And in spite of all difficulties, they managed to do it over a very, very long period of time. Today, the adjective Byzantine is used to describe devious actions, intrigue, plotting, bribing. Historical records show that Byzantine politics were morally neither worse nor better than politics in previous or later years in our time. And in the end, their diplomacy served the Byzantines very well. In conclusion, Byzantine played an important role as Europe's buffer for incubator of nations and religions in Central Asia and Middle East. By resisting attacks and skillfully integrating new peoples, Slavs, Avars, Arabs, Turks, Byzantines gave Europe time to recover from catastrophic plagues and wars and prepare for the European age of global affairs, which we still live. In June, our historical journey moves to Renaissance diplomacy, diplomacy of Italian city-states, the main successor to the tools and methods of Byzantine diplomacy. And we learn the story of the Byzantine diplomacy by quoting the Byzantine historian John Kinamos, who said a few centuries before Machiavelli, since many and various matters lead towards one end, victory, it is a matter of indifference which one uses to reach it. You can recognize Machiavelli in this. Now let's quickly zoom out to the east, where at the same time, a different empire flourished. The largest empire in the history, the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan, who ruled between 1206 to 1227, first united the many nomadic tribes of North Asia and set a number of really successful military campaigns that spread his rule from Korea to Caspian Sea. His successor continued to expand, reaching Poland and Asia Minor in the west and conquering the whole China. We should keep in mind, and this is the reason why I'm bringing into discussion Mongol Empire, that many empires after Mongols, after Genghis Khan, tried to control Eurasia continent, including Napoleon, including Hitler, including various actors, but nobody succeeded except Mongols. The foremost benefit of the largest land empire the world has ever seen was that trade routes from one side of Eurasia to another, including the famed Silk Road on which Marco Polo traveled, were safe and well-maintained, ushering in an era of great exchange between West and East. The new empire practiced religious tolerance, merit over birth privileges, and equality before law. The Mongol Empire was open to various influences. Same goes for the empire's diplomacy. In contact with other powers, it was able to use their cultural frameworks, and Mongols employed specialized personnel for this. The rule of this vast empire were fairly simple: surrender, be loyal, and enjoy privileges or perish. The aim of their diplomacy was to set up a network of more or less formal dependency. It was to some extent this interplay between force and diplomacy which was mastered by this empire. And as always, we will finish our discussion with the drink of the era, drink of the time. And the drink of the Byzantine Empire was wine. The original Byzantine were considered to be the foremost enophiles of the ancient world. It was said they could not bear the sound of the war trumpet even in their dreams, as their ears were accustomed to the sound of the flutes of the drinking parties. That was one of the metaphors. Both Constantinople and the whole empire were viewed as places where wine flowed freely, and since then existed the proverb, Byzantium conquers all with its wine. The monasteries and the churches in general were catalysts, both for dissemination and the Christianization of wine culture, and to evolution of famous symposia, drinking parties, inherited by Greece, but with more morally acceptable form of wine consumption and overall enjoyment. A number of Byzantine provinces were renowned for their sweet aromatic wines, Bithynia in particular. Many celebrated wines were also produced in the early Byzantine period in Syria and Palestine, in the reconquered Carthage, in Egypt, on the Aegean Islands, in the Peloponnese, and in Italy. Therefore, it was very, very rich wine culture. Wine was a key part of Byzantine diet. The average Byzantine adult male drank about 1 liter per day. Women would drink about half liter of wine per day, and children a bit less. So the average family consumption was about 2 liters a day. And the city of Antioch, with 150,000 citizens, consume 50 million liters of wine each year. Why was wine so important? First, it was a terrific source of calories. Between 40 and 80 grams of carbs you have in 1 liter of wine. So adult male were getting 160 to 320 calories from their wine. About the same as eating today a burger. Plus its full nutrients, particularly potassium and vitamin C, were very useful. In an age when diseases were endemic, these nutrients in wine help replenish those lost, for example, from diarrhea, which was frequent. It was also safer to drink the wine than most sources of water. People who could not afford wine drank so-called posca, and I wouldn't advise to try it. It was a drink made by mixing vinegar, water, and perhaps some herbs. It was more or less, it has a taste of a wine gone sour, possibly mixed with the sweeteners or other flavors to make it taste a bit better. We don't really know it. It was drunk by soldiers, lower class, and slaves. The advantage was that it had already gone bad, so it had a pretty stable shelf life for shipping into cities or out to distant military posts. Well, that's more or less what we had today for Byzantine diplomacy. We'll hear from Katarina later on. In June, our historical journey will move to Renaissance diplomacy of Italian city-state, the main successors to the tools and methods of the Byzantine diplomacy. Now let me see, Katerina, before we cheer, if there are any questions and comments.
Indeed, there are actually a lot of questions coming in the last 10 minutes. So Andrew also asked, how come diplomacy didn't seem to be successful during the early Muslim conquests in the times of Heraclius? Was it simply a failure because of a lack of knowledge of the new Arab regime that did not allow them to react quick enough? Then he mentioned that while the Byzantines were flexible and managed to adapt, Andrew noted that the dangers of not having a secure system of succession was a problem, and then the Byzantines loved their civil wars, and therefore he asked, would it be accurate to say that internal politics was far worse than external? Yolanda then wonders if you would blame any aspect of Byzantium diplomacy for the empire's eventual defeat by the Ottomans. And lastly, Deirdre asked if the Mongol Empire homogenized values or imposed a system of their own. So that will be all from my end.
Katerina, you will help me with reminding me to all questions, because well, I consume just a little bit of wine, but let me start with a very interesting. Andrew, thank you for excellent questions. This question between the Arabs conquer and the reaction. Obviously, there were many aspects. One is different in the culture. The second one is underestimating the importance and the power of Arabs. The third was that Arab culture at that time was in full swing, and it wasn't ready that much for compromise. Byzantium tried to outreach, like they did it much more successfully towards Slavs. Therefore, they more or less pacified Slavs mainly through the Christianity, through the religious tool, through the Christianization of the Slavic tribes in the Balkans and further north. Therefore, they couldn't use that, and I have to see in details. It's a really interesting question, but my guess is that these are two or three major elements that contributed to that. As later on, when you can see with the Arab emperors, especially in the West, when they were losing the power, they were more inclined towards use diplomacy. The same happens more or less with Ottomans. But one difference with the Byzantine is that even when they were very powerful, they prefer diplomacy. That's the typical pattern is when you have a might, you don't need diplomacy. When your might started declining, you use diplomacy. Byzantine exercised diplomacy from the very first day. That was deeper in their administrative political culture. Now, your second question, Andrew, about internal conflicts. Obviously, this is a definitely generalization focusing on diplomacy and technology. They had internal fights. There was an open question for succession, and we have many examples of internal battles. But what was more or less unifying was this administrative culture and something when even empire was going politically down, administrative system was holding it somehow. A friend of mine told me that, for example, in Italy nowadays, the best time is that when you don't have a strong government or politicians in control, because then administration can run the society. That's vague analogy with this period. Then Yolanda's question, Katerina, please.
Yes, she asked if you would blame any aspect of Byzantium diplomacy for the empire's eventual defeat by the Ottomans.
Well, that was amazing how they survived. The Ottomans came almost 2 or 3 centuries. Ottomans started dealing with the Western empires. Obviously, what Venice did with Constantinople and the Byzantine, it was basically in 13th century, it was the beginning of the end, because it was a real defeat when they, for the first time, let foreigners come within the walls of the Constantinople. And as you know from the history, it was the basically betrayal of one of the members of the elite. We can frame it, but there was simply it outlived its time for 3 or 4 centuries, Byzantine Empire, and there was no anymore, neither diplomacy, nor economy, nor military to save Byzantine Empire from Ottoman arrival. That was too far. There is there is a time, like in our lives in the States, there is a time where you cannot anymore move on, because the elixirs, social elixir, political elixirs, whatever, military disappears. And this is why we call it longevity of Byzantine. It really lasted very, very long, given the pressure, and therefore I don't think the diplomacy could have played any role. And if I'm correct, Desiree, you ask if Mongols helped to unify Europe. Well, you can apply the same for the Ottoman Empire or Arabs as well. I would say that culturally, yes, there was the sort of fear, because Mongols were not gentle actors, although, as we mentioned, they used some elements of diplomacy as supplement to their military might. I think that a lot of European identity was designed around others, us and others, and including Byzantine, which is very interesting. The term Byzantine Empire was introduced and pushed a lot by Western scholars to make distinction between a proper Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire based in Rome, and Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, because people in Byzantine called themselves as Romans, and they were, strictly speaking, they used Latin in the early centuries. Later on, they started using Greek. They were culturally, organizationally part of the Roman Empire. Therefore, a lot of European identity was created in this element, us and them, us and Byzantine, us and Ottomans, and in particular us and Romans. Therefore, the answer to your question, yes, it was one of the unifying elements in creating European identity or way of framing things, or in contradiction to others. Katerina?
Yes, there is one more question left. We have just received it, and it is, what led to the demise of the Byzantine Empire? Can you say it in one sentence, maybe?
One tweet.
It is too broad.
Really, this period of almost 12 centuries of lasting, almost impossible place to survive. Just look at the map today. Look at today's history of what's happening in the Middle East. But at that time, you have a much more sort of antagonistic Slavic tribes coming from the north. Therefore, longevity, impossible. place, and I would say exhaustion of the cultural, scientific, and to some extent moral and religious elixirs which were running the empire in the early centuries. A bit longer. Well, the wine definitely didn't cause too many problems. Therefore, it's if the questions are exhausted, Katerina, I would like to invite you that we have a glass of wine. I don't know for other participants, I invite you as well. But
thank you. I'll take a few sips. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
We shall bring you further news as quickly as we have.